What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to basketball. And more importantly, welcome back to our season preview series. If you didn't watch the first episode, I would encourage you guys probably to go watch that one. It was on the Boston Celtics. It gives kind of a complete overview as to what this series is and what we're going to be covering during it, so it might be worth your time. But to give you a quick synopsis, the point of this series is to take a look at every single NBA team before the start of the season. There's a lot of them to cover, so we got to start now, and just really give a good in-depth look as to where the team is right now, the direction that we think they're going into, the problems that could arise, the points that they need to address, give a salary cap breakdown, a rotation breakdown, everything possible so that you guys can be ready for the NBA season. But hey, make sure you guys like, subscribe, and comment. I've responded to every single comment on my YouTube channel up to this point, and I intend to keep on doing so. Alrighty, let's get into it. And so we're back here on the season preview spreadsheet. I know that this looks a little bit basic. This is kind of the drop-in page. We'll be getting into additions and losses, a roster and financial breakdown, rotations, everything like that. And then at the end, you'll get my prediction as to where I think that the team is going to go. A reminder that if you want access to this spreadsheet, it's pretty simple. Just go down and leave me a comment on this video saying, I would like access to the spreadsheet. I tell you guys, I read every single comment. I promise I do. What I'll do is I'll drop you a link to the Discord on there. You can join the Discord. I encourage you to stay if you want to talk basketball, but once you're on the Discord, shoot me a DM. I'll get you hooked up with this sheet and you can play around and make whatever scenarios you want for the NBA season. I think it's a pretty cool thing, but without further ado, we're here with the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, the Memphis Grizzlies had a weird season last year, but one that I was very interested in following throughout the season because they were in a very unique spot. They were a team that had, they were entering this stage of really growth with their young core, and they had found some pieces that made some sense to keep around. And then all of them got hurt/suspended. Like every single person. I've never seen this happen before. Like basically everybody was out, except for Jaren Jackson for points of the season. But I mean, even he was out at certain points for small amounts of time. But anyway, you get into this weird spot then where you're like, okay, we were this team that was expecting to be contending, but now we're going to be a lottery team. As you can see, 27-55 last season. That actually ended up getting them, what was it? I think it was the 8th pick in the draft. So now all of a sudden they're like, okay, we can add another piece to this young core, given it wasn't the greatest draft ever. And I would say that the Grizzlies ultimately kind of failed on a couple things that they tried to do this offseason. But the point was, nonetheless, that they were in this spot where they're like, okay, during the whole season, we can throw out some of our young guys and see what sticks, right? Like what's going to happen if we do X, Y, Z, right? And that was kind of the cool thing that we got to see. We saw the rise of like a Vince Williams, Gigi Jackson, etc., Scottie Pippen Jr. even, who we'll talk about him at some point too. But nonetheless, it was a really, really interesting spot. And now everyone's back. And that's why I've got our franchise status. And for those of you unfamiliar with the series, there's a couple different statuses you can have here: selling, rebuilding, growing, or contending. I would put Memphis in growing, right? They're still young. They're still trying to figure a lot of things out. They've got some new young rotation pieces that are going to be a thing. They've still got some developmental pieces, but we expect them to be competitive and in the playoffs and fighting to see how far they can get. So that's kind of the goal. As far as goals specifically, I've got build chemistry. That's going to be a big one, right? The guys have been out for a little bit. Desmond Baines, Marcus Smarts, Ja Morant, all with Jaren Jackson, starting to play with some of these new guys like the Gigi Jacksons, the Vince Williams, Jake LaRavias, right? Et cetera, right? Obviously, Zach Edey's a new guy on the team. Build chemistry. Next one, establish identity. Because if you think about this Memphis Grizzlies team, I know at least me, whenever I think about the Memphis Grizzlies, I think about the grit and grind Grizzlies. But this isn't that team, right? Like it's just different. So what is going to be the identity of this team? They don't necessarily have a bunch of like elite scorers on this team. Actually, I'd argue they don't have one even on this team as an elite scorer. So are they going to be an elite defensive team? Well, there's kind of questions at the center position. We don't know. They're missing a lot of like lengthy wings on this team. So like, what is this team going to be this year? What is the culture going to be around this team? What is it going to be their goal to try and be better at than everybody else, right? And then I've got the last one, which is find a center, or maybe I should say figure out who's the center. Maybe it's on the roster already. Maybe it is Zach Edey, but for the time being, we don't necessarily know. And that's because the Grizzlies set themselves up to be in a really good spot this offseason. They set themselves up to where they were like, okay, we're going to have all this cap space and everything. We're going to have assets that we can move. We're moving on from other guys so that we can really kind of structure this team the way that we want around this interesting core that we have. And they kind of didn't do much with it, and they couldn't because people just re-signed other places. They struck out on adding like a bunch of centers that they wanted or a bunch of wings. They didn't really find a great way to move Zaire Williams as like a part of a deal in some capacity, so they struck out in a lot of ways. And I mean, let's just take a look at the adds and versus losses here, which is pretty minimal. At the end of the day, let me zoom out really quick. So again, if this is your first time seeing the series, which is second video, so it very well could be, we got a couple different things here. Drafted players, you guys can figure out that one. Player departures, either they haven't re-signed with anybody yet, they're just not on the team right now. Those are departures. Players brought in via like either trade or we'll say just like signing. This is what they got. And I was also just realizing I didn't include the Zaire Williams Diakite move there. But you know what? Now it's fixed. You know what? I was making this really late last night, so it is what it is. But anyway, so the drafted players, let's start off with that one, right? Zach Edey, obviously that's the big question mark for them. Extremely dominant college player, went a lot higher in the draft than a lot of us expected him to go into. You're getting an enormous person that's pretty good around the rim. He's a pretty smart basketball player. Is he going to be ready to come in and be a starting NBA center right away? I've got questions about that. They also took Jalen Wells in like the second round, who's a lengthy, athletic wing. Going to be a developmental project for them. They also took Cam Spencer, who comes in and he's probably going to be a two-way player this year. Had a really good summer league. Summer league's not a good correlation of like being good in the rest of like the NBA or anything like that. It's just a completely different game, but seems like a smart, savvy player that maybe they could turn into something down the road. Who did they lose? Lamar Stevens wasn't like a huge part of their team last year. Yuta Watanabe went back to Japan. He was a good shooter, but really didn't get a ton of burn for them last year. Zaire Williams was a top 10 pick for them at one point that looked really good early on. Didn't really work out. The last like 3 years with him since then, or 2 years, I guess I should say. And so they were like, well, we know that there's something in there. We just haven't been able to bring it out. So they moved him over to the Nets. Not a surprise that they want him. And they got a Diakite back, who they got from the Knicks as a part of like the Bojan and like Bridges trade or whatever. So he's on the Grizzlies now. So there you go. So really not a lot of movement for a team that really tried to set themselves up for something this offseason. I know like other transactions have happened, like the Luke Kennard, like re-signing and everything. I just don't show that on here. I show like new things that have happened, either players no longer on the team or new players added to the team for comparison's sake. So you didn't lose a ton, didn't necessarily gain a ton either, and you set yourself up to really try to make some moves, and it just didn't really happen. If it were me, I like what I would have liked to have seen, which maybe was unrealistic to think this. It would have been great if they could have found a way to move like an Edey and like another pick and like Zaire Williams or something like that, and you go find yourself a better center that's a little bit more proven because you're trying to win some basketball games right now. But hey, maybe Zach Edey ends up being that guy and it doesn't matter anyway, right? But at the end of the day, you've got some holes on this team that we're not quite sure how they're going to fill them yet. So let's get into this roster kind of breakdown so that we can start to see what that actually looks like. So those of you that have been following the channel for a certain amount of time now probably recognize what this sheet looks like. This looks a lot like the ideal offseason spreadsheet because it's pretty damn close. We're missing a little thing over here, but otherwise, exact same thing, right? So the team, or the goal with this all, is to take a look at the team via depth chart, pick situation, cap situation, individual contracts, and just roster breakdown in general. We're going to probably spend the most amount of time on this page right here, doing a full diagnostic of the team. Where do we see strengths? Where do we see weaknesses? And just give you a good all-around picture as to where this team's at right now. And let's start off here. Let's start off with salary cap space. Now, this is an important one, right? The rules around basketball are changing, and they're changing quickly, especially with the additions of the aprons. If you guys followed my ideal off seasons and stuff, you know how this works already. But nonetheless, I want to spend some time and I want to talk about it. So there's really 4 important, like, we'll call it numeric values that you need to know when you're looking at NBA cap space. There's the cap itself. There's luxury tax, the first apron and the second apron. You probably heard a lot of teams talking about these. They're extremely complicated. The goal of the aprons is to restrict teams from making too many crazy moves. The NBA was sick of teams trading their best players all the time. There's no continuity. Fans can't get attached to teams anymore. That's bad for the sport. They want teams to or players to have longevity with their teams, so they're making it harder and incentivizing teams to keep their own players. And that's what they've done here. Cap space, right? The Grizzlies are out of cap space. They've also passed the luxury tax amount. When this hits 0, that means they've run out of luxury tax dollars. So now they're just sitting in luxury tax. They haven't hit the first apron yet, which is important. If this were to hit 0, it means that they've hit the first apron, so they're not being hit with any of these crazy restrictions that a lot of other teams are. So they're actually pretty flexible and can make a lot more moves right now. Basically, all this means is that because they're in luxury tax, they can't go sign a player for anything more than a minimum contract. For those of you that don't know, you can always sign your own players to go over luxury tax for whatever amount they want. Bird rights kind of depends on or influences that in some capacity, but we don't need to talk about that here. But with luxury tax, you can only sign guys that weren't on your team the previous season to a minimum. That's the most that you can do for them. So they're not going to bring in like another big superstar right now, obviously, but it's not like one exists in free agency anyway. But they haven't hit the apron, which means that they're still free to make certain amounts of moves, right? And now they could hit the apron with certain incentives or things like that, depending on how contracts are situated. But for the time being, they're not in the first apron, so they can make as many moves as they want. Let's go take a look at like the roster itself to see what's going on. Ja Morant, he's locked up for a while. That's awesome, right? Your best player, most likely. I might make an argument that right now Jaren Jackson's their best player, but he's locked up for a while. Desmond Bane, locked up for a while, right? His big contract is just kicking in. Honestly, it's not that bad compared to other contracts nowadays. Jaren Jackson, got 2 seasons left, and you'll probably have to start having extension talks with him, so this will be a good year to kind of see all of that. Same with Marcus Smart. We didn't get to see him play with any of the big-time players last season. He was hurt for most of it, so hopefully he can stay healthy this year. Luke Kennard got a 1-year deal to come back, so that's great for him in that sense. He's going to be a valuable spacer on this team for a team that doesn't have a ton of natural spacers out there. Brandon Clark, coming off an ACL injury, I believe it was ACL, right? So he was a guy that relied a lot on his athleticism and his ability to crash the glass constantly. Is he going to be able to do that? We don't know, but he's locked up for a while, which is good. And it's a pretty tradable contract, this $12.5 million. And remember, because they're not in any of the aprons, they're pretty much free to do whatever kinds of trades they want, like within like basic like trade logic and everything. So that's awesome. John Conchar, kind of a do a bit of everything kind of guy, very trade-friendly contract, locked up for a couple years. Zach Edey, who they got with what I believe is the 8th pick, comes in here. He's got a nice cheap contract for the next 4 seasons, and then he becomes a restricted free agent, so he's locked up for a while. And again, I think you're going to see these guys sticking around a lot more because it's so hard to add talent once you get into these aprons and stuff, or even the luxury tax, right? Because the example I gave in the last video, and I'll give it again here, the Denver Nuggets, they lost Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. They were in like the 2nd apron, and that they dropped down to the 1st apron. So you'd be like, oh, well, they can go give that like $18 million to someone else. No, they can't, because they're still in luxury tax. So you can't just go bring another player in for that same amount. You can only give them a minimum. So you want to keep your players. That's the important thing nowadays. You keep your own players. Other guys on the team, pretty interesting players. Santi Aldama can play the 4 or the 5. He can put the ball on the floor a little bit, shoot a little bit. Where's he going to fit in the rotation? We don't know. There's going to be a position battle between like Brandon Clark, Zach Edey, Aldama, Jake LaRavia. Where are all those guys going to fit in with everything? Hell, Gigi Jackson maybe even as well fits into those positions at times. Derrick Rose, veteran point guard to have on the team, good leadership guy. Makes a lot of sense. Jake LaRavia technically has 2 years left on his contract, but I've highlighted that it's technically a team option after this season, which makes sense for a guy at this point of his career. There's always like team options for the last couple of years of the young players. I like Jake LaRavia's development a lot and where he's going, but they kind of have a log jam at his position, so I don't know exactly how he gets on the court yet, and we'll talk about that. We have Kite, who he very well could not be on the final roster here. A reminder that it's August 3rd at the time of filming this. I'm pre-recording because I'm actually on my honeymoon at the time you're seeing this. Hopefully I made it there. So shoot me a message on Discord and ask me how it's going when you guys see this or whatever. But he does not have a guaranteed contract, so he could go and they could get someone else in that position. So just know that that's the case, and I actually would probably advocate for that because I don't think they need him on this team, and they could go get somebody else that's maybe more valuable at another position. Now you get into 2 really interesting players, Vince Williams Jr. and Gigi Jackson. Both of them are on very cheap contracts going forward because they were very kind of like low level, like young guys coming into the league and were kind of looked over. Both of them played out of their minds last year for points of the season. Vince Williams Jr. was a primary ball handler that could attack and play great defense and be a bit of a playmaker. Gigi Jackson, elite shooter, elite like athlete and everything. Could put the ball on the floor a little bit. We got to see him in summer league start to do that just a little bit more. So you're like, okay, these 2 guys look like they're going to be a part of it. This was the benefit of everyone going down last season. Now we know that these 2 guys exist. We can throw them in their rotation players now. That's awesome. Great discoveries. And then we got rookie Jalen Wells, who's on a nice, long, cheap contract. That's the value of these late first and second round picks for these like teams that are trying to get better. Easy way to fill out the roster for not much money, right? He's going to be a developmental piece for them, going to take a minute, but at least he's like a lengthier wing that they have on the roster, because as you guys will see, we're kind of missing that. If we can look at this from a depth chart kind of position now, let's start off with like the first 5, because I'm sure you guys actually probably have questions about this. This is if I was the coach, this is what I would roll out day 1 type thing. I'm not saying that this can't change. I can't say that this is exactly what they're going to do. This is how I would view it. So I'd start off with Ja Morant, Marcus Smart, Desmond Bane, GG Jackson. That's kind of where things get a little bit interesting, and Jaren Jackson at the 4. Let's address the elephant in the room. Don't have Zach Edey in the starting 5. I'm personally of the belief I need to let the young guys prove it a little bit first, and I personally don't think I've seen enough of him in like college and even like the summer league and everything to think like this guy's just going to be able to come in and be like a day 1 player. Do I think that maybe there could be a point during this season where he becomes a starting center? Sure, of course not. That'd be ignorant of me to say not, right? Like we hope the development happens, but I think that this provides us a little bit of a different level of like dynamicness, because we don't have a great identity on this team. We don't have a lot of like true scoring. You'll say, oh, Ja Morant, true scorer, but like even he's not like a 3-level scorer or anything like that, right? Marcus Smart, surely not. Desmond Bane can do a little bit of a lot of things well. He's going to be undersized at that position. We're going to be undersized just in like the 1 through 3 to start anyway. So what I want to do is continue to add people that can somewhat put the ball on the floor, kind of like what the OKC Thunder do in GG Jackson. He adds a little bit more spacing. He adds a level of athleticism that you don't necessarily see in like our wings here, but you can kind of have it here. He can switch on to other like positions and probably be just fine. That adds a new layer of kind of like the defense and everything. He's just dynamic, right? He can do a little bit more than say like a Zach Edey if you threw him out there right now and you move Jaren Jackson over to the power forward. Is the goal to get Jaren Jackson to the power forward? Yes, it certainly is. But for the time being, I'd rather roll this out and see kind of how this works. I think it's a little bit better. Jaren Jackson at the 5, it's fine. It's not the biggest deal. Like, again, we'd want him at the 4 most likely, but he can play the 5. This will give you at least the ability to have spacing all throughout the floor, which is good when you have a Ja Morant surrounded by a Marcus Smart at the other guard, and maybe you throw a Luke Kennard in there instead and you really have some spacing. But nonetheless, I think this is probably what they do. Marcus Smart's a tone setter. He's a good defender. He's a good player. He's good to have out there. So I think that this gives them enough runway to let like the Ja Morants and GG Jacksons get to the rim. You have some spacers and other guys that can go out there and play switching defense. I think that's a good 5 and a good closing 5. Talking about the rest of the depth, not a ton going on at point guard. I know Marcus Smart can kind of fill in there. You got Derrick Rose, who he's at least going to be like serviceable for his age, which is not saying like a ton. He's not going to be great, but he's out there. Luke Kennard, he's going to be a valuable piece of this team. Just a lethal shooter. He even had to do a little bit of ball handling last year. It's not like he's great at it by any means, but nonetheless, that's what it is, right? You get to the small forward, and small is the word I want you to kind of focus on with these guys. And I'm going to zoom in and talk about it for a bit, because we are missing length at the wings. We are really missing that. Desmond Bane, small guy for a wing. Vince Williams, small guy for a wing. John Conchar, small guy for a wing. Jalen Wells, got some size, not going to be ready to play most likely. So what do? Right? Well, we probably got to make a trade at some point, because we've got some depth in other positions, and we'll get to the power forward, but can we add like a lengthy wing or something to this team where then we can move Marcus Smart to the bench? We can move Bane back to the 2 in some capacity, because like I like Vince Williams Jr. I think he'll be valuable, especially since he can handle the rock a little bit more. John Conchar can do a little bit of that if needed, but like I'd just rather add that kind of 3-and-D wing to this team somehow. And those guys are hard to find. It would have been nice if Zaire Williams could have developed into that, but nonetheless, he didn't. If we take a look at the power forward, then we've got Santi Aldama and Jake LaRavia. Santi Aldama has proven that he can go out there, get you 10 points and 5 rebounds and probably be pretty fine from 3, right? Jake LaRavia is starting to develop a little bit more, so I wouldn't be surprised if he kind of comes onto the scene. Maybe he can even play a little bit of wing. I don't feel great about that. I'd rather him and Gigi kind of be the power forwards. I think Aldama could be a decent one to move. You look at Brandon Clark as a maybe you could move him, a John Conchar. See if you can't find a wing, because I like LaRavia. He's showing that he can put the ball on the floor a little bit. He's got kind of a Luka-style game to him, because he knows how to use like his weight and his strength more than like his actual speed. So maybe we can do something where we take a Santi Aldama and like a Conchar or something like that, and we can go get somebody else, maybe throw in a Brandon Clark as well, because again, let's take advantage of this, of the fact that we're not restricted by any of the aprons right now, which, by the way, if you guys get the sheet, you can look at what the actual like restrictions are here. I've included those there, but the power forward position will be interesting nonetheless. We go to center, you got Diakite, who again doesn't need to necessarily be on the roster. Brandon Clark, who again, we don't know, coming off of injury, which he was known a lot for his athleticism, so we'll see. Zach Edey could find his way into the starting center spot. That'd be great. That helps us a little bit already, right, if he becomes that good, but we don't want to bank on it. A guy we're missing here is a Scottie Pippen Jr., who's looking like he should just be an NBA player at this point. He looks like he'd be a pretty solid backup point guard, at least in my evaluation. Maybe he's gone. Maybe you take a Diakite off of here and you throw in a Scottie Pippen Jr., and I'd probably just rather have that on the team than the alternative, but that's just my observation at the end of the day. If we can then take a look at draft picks and everything, we'll just spend some time highlighting it. Actually, pretty solid draft situation all said and done. You ended up getting a first-round pick this year. That's awesome. Hopefully Zach Edey's valuable. You have your first-round pick going into next year. It's a valuable draft. Awesome, right? You have possibly 2 first-round picks next year. You have your own, which is great, which means you could trade it if you really want to, but you also have this kind of complicated one. It could be a couple teams, kind of hard to tell. You've got all your first-round picks going forward then, which is really, really exciting. You got some second-round picks that you can still use, so pretty good draft situation all said and done for how like good this team is. You would expect a team that's in like the growing category to probably be missing more picks than this, but actually they've done a really good job of managing their draft pick situation, so you should feel good about that, Grizzlies fans. Okay, so we've talked about the team enough now. We kind of have an idea for the depth and where they could probably use a little bit more help, but let's take a better look at it here by looking at it from a rotation point of view, and I need to change the titles on all of these again. There we go. I've changed it to rotation. There we go. And I put a question mark there just for the sole purpose of like, I obviously don't know what it's going to be. The idea with these rotations is when I was a coach, we would always try to be like, okay, where do we kind of want players to average out at, right? It's like you're filling it out in 2K, like my GM mode or whatever, right? Obviously, there's going to be times where you're getting spanked or you're spanking another team. You guys are going to play less. Sometimes a close game, you got to play the better players more. But this is kind of where I want things to average out. Ja Morant should be playing a lot of minutes. He hasn't really even entered the prime of his career yet. He's a stud player. You want him probably at about 34 minutes. Marcus Smart, getting onto the older side now, falling out of his prime, so obviously still a valuable guy. How much can you play him next to Ja Morant even is probably a question, so we're keeping him more below the 30 minutes a game mark. Desmond Bane falls in that same category as Ja Morant. Want him around 33 minutes. Gigi Jackson's still kind of proving himself, but I want him in the first 5 for now, so he's going to be more so around the 27. Jaren Jackson Jr., again, one of the better players we got. The floor spacing of him and Ja Morant is awesome. That is perfect, right? That's the kind of guy you want, setting pick and rolls and pick and fades more so with Ja Morant, so want him getting a lot of burn. We've only got a 9-man rotation going on now, though, because I don't know what to do with like the rest of this roster. Luke Kennard's got to get a lot of burn next to Ja Morant. You need the spacing next to him. That's just a given. Zach Edey, you presume he's going to get a lot of burn, and they're going to try to figure out if he can be that starting center. He might just be the starting center, but that's probably where I'd put him at minutes-wise for now, is this kind of 24 mark. Like, he's had questions in the past about him being in shape. I know he's gotten a ton better shape, but never had this long of a season before, so you don't want to get him hurt or get him hurt early or anything. Santi Aldama is probably who I'd put in next, just because I've already seen him do it before, and he's going to be consistent. You can throw him in at a 5, even next with a Jaren Jackson, or at the 4. It doesn't really matter. The versatility of him is pretty nice. 19-20 minutes a game, I feel good about that. And then we want Vince Williams on the court, just being a guy that can kind of attack maybe when Ja Morant is out. I probably wouldn't play them together necessarily, but I could see like a Marcus Smart point guard type thing, or if they find a way to get Scottie Pippen, have him in with a Vince Williams, and then maybe have like the Baines and like the Jaren Jackson Jr.'s in there with them, and you're like, okay, now we've kind of got something. We can let Vince cook a little bit more, because that's where he was really thriving last year. We want to give him a chance to really cook like he was. We don't want to take him out of that situation by any means. Looking at the rest of the guys, I see like Laravia being the next guy, like Brandon Clark hopefully finding a way back on the court somehow. John Konchar's just ready when he's ready. Same with Rose and Wells and Diakite. Like, these 2 guys, I just don't expect them to get a ton of burn along with Rose. So that's why I'm saying you kind of have these 3 guys here who I'd like to get Laravia more burn, because I see a little bit higher potential than Santi Aldama. So maybe a combination of him, Conchar, and Clark gets you somewhere and gets you that wing that you've really been looking for and opens up space for somebody else. That would be my hope somehow, because again, you're seeing like this is a small basketball team in a lot of places, and we're just really missing that traditional wing. And I don't know who you go to try and solve that problem on this team. Like, hopefully it's Wells down the line, but that's a lot to ask out of a second-round pick. So I just don't know. But for now, I couldn't see myself going past a 9-man rotation with this one. Like, I think you just have to stick with this core group until you can find some other pieces to help supplement it. So with all this being said, right, like, there's obviously a need to address a couple things. We've noted how maybe we're releasing him, maybe we're trading some of these guys, right? We've got pretty good pick solutions, so there's probably a trade in the horizon somewhere with this growing team, right? We're trying to build chemistry and establish an identity. We want to make moves now while we can, because we're gonna have to pay Jaren Jackson in a couple of years or something like that, right? Make a move now is probably what you want to do. Where do I see the Grizzlies standing as of right now? Drumroll, please. Boo. Make your predictions in the comments now. Go boost my algorithm. I got them as the 8th seed. I know. I've got them as the 8th seed. I don't anticipate them going higher than this right now. Maybe they do. Maybe the star power of like a Ja Morant and like Jaren Jackson, maybe that's enough in some capacity to make it happen. But I personally have them as the 8th seed right now, and I know that's hard to imagine because you don't see all the rest of the teams here right now, but that's as high as I'm putting them. When I lined up all the teams and I was kind of placing them on my whiteboard and everything, I'm like, shit. Like, I think when I first started, I had them at like 5 or something like that, and then I was like, no, they're not better than this team. They're not better than this team. They have too many questions. Like this, I'd take this team over them, and that's where they fell for the time being, is the 8th seed. But hey, as always, let me know your comments on it at the end of the day. Like, I want to hear about that. I want to see what you guys think with all this. What moves do you want to see the Grizzlies make this year? Because there's clearly some holes that they need to fill that they didn't get to address in the offseason. But we're in a pretty good spot to make some moves, and we've got some good talent already. It's just kind of adding those next couple pieces. So who do you think it should be and why? As a reminder, because I'm recording this early, if something does happen, like trade-wise, I'll basically make like a small update video with all of these and just kind of refine things a little bit. But as always, thank you guys for watching, and you guys will get your next video on Friday. Thanks so much. Bye.